I've spoken recently to a number of groups about drunk driving, or as it's called in Louisiana, operating while intoxicated. But that's a broad-ranging speech, covers a lot of topics. It's about a 45-minute talk. So I was asked to talk today on this video about the most frequently asked question that gets posed to me. The most frequently asked question that I get is, what should I do if I've had a couple of drinks, maybe dinner out with my friends or my spouse, and I come upon an OWI checkpoint? I felt fine when I left the restaurant, but now that I'm being pulled over, I'm a little scared. I've got some concerns. Specifically, how do I avoid a conviction after being pulled over? And it really comes down to three things. You can call it the 3 secrets to avoiding a drunk driving conviction. And numbers 2 and 3 are actually given to every driver by the police themselves. So my answer is, be polite to the police. Remember that you have the right to tell the officer that you don't want to answer any questions or take any field sobriety tests without a lawyer. And number 3, remember that you have the right to refuse the breath test. My name is Kirk Piccione, and I've been a criminal defense lawyer in Louisiana for over 30 years. I'm one of only a handful of lawyers certified in the past by the Supreme Court to handle death penalty cases. But in addition to major felonies, I also handle every other type of criminal case, right down to misdemeanors and including drunk driving cases, which is what we're here to talk about today. So let's examine the 3 points on how to avoid a drunk driving conviction in a little bit more detail. The first one is be polite to the police. And don't lie. You don't need to lie to the police. I've been practicing criminal defense law for over 30 years. I've cross-examined hundreds of police officers in trials and hearings. I pick apart and criticize the work that they do. We are adversaries. But when I see them in public, we always talk, and it's very pleasant. That's because I'm polite to them. And even when I'm cross-examining them, I treat them with the respect that they deserve. They're mostly just regular folks doing a job. And although I'm telling you that you can refuse to answer their questions, that doesn't mean that you have to be rude. If you're polite to them, the chances are they will return that politeness to you. For example, the officer will ask you whether you've been drinking tonight. And we all know he's not talking about Diet Coke. But you don't have to lie or be rude. You just say, "Officer, thank you for your service, but I really don't want to answer any questions without a lawyer." So that's number 1, be polite to the police. And that leads us to number 2. Remember that you have the right to tell the police officer that you don't want to answer any questions or take any field sobriety tests without a lawyer. Now notice, I said answer questions or take any tests. That's because the police officer will ask you some questions about whether you've been breaking the law, like, have you been drinking tonight? And he will ask you to perform some field sobriety tests. If you tell him, "I want a lawyer" first, he will stop questioning you, and he will not make you perform the field sobriety tests. Here's something to think about. From the moment you're stopped by the police, everything you do and say is being recorded. The police officer's vehicle has a dashboard camera. The officer himself is mic'd up, and he probably also has a body cam, and your conversation is being recorded. A lot of people don't know this, but the back seat of the officer's vehicle has a camera and a microphone, and everything you do and say is being recorded. Once you get to the police station, there are cameras and microphones in the room where the breath test is offered, and everything you do and say is being recorded. Now, why do you think the police go to such great lengths to record everything you do and say? It's because they intend to use it against you in court to prove that you were driving drunk. So, the more you say, the more answers you give, the more you participate, the more evidence you are giving them to convict you. And the police tell people this. They tell people that they're going to use their words against them in court. A lot of people don't pay enough attention to it, but it's all there in the Miranda rights that the officers read to every person they suspect has committed a crime. These are those Miranda rights. Usually the officers kind of speed read them. I'm going to read them to you a little bit more slowly. Number one, you have the right to remain silent. If you give up that right to remain silent, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Number two, and this is a separate right, you have the right to speak to an attorney before making any statements, and to have an attorney present during questioning. If you can't afford an attorney, one will be provided to you. You can exercise these rights at any time during questioning. And then they ask you, do you understand the rights I've just read to you? And with those rights in mind, do you wish to speak to me? So, understanding this, you can stop questioning at any time by one, refusing to answer further, or two, by requesting a lawyer. Now, I'm going to get a little bit esoteric on you with some constitutional law, but just briefly. These are two of your most important constitutional rights. The first is based on your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. The second is based on your Sixth Amendment right to a lawyer. Both of these can be used to cut off interrogation by the police. But the Sixth Amendment right to a lawyer is more powerful. Why is that? Well, that's because the Supreme Court of the United States has said that when you assert your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, what you're saying in essence is, I have decided that I don't want to talk to the police. It's you who made the decision. So the police can continue to talk to you, and they can even try to persuade you to change your mind. But when you assert your Sixth Amendment right to a lawyer, what you're basically saying is, I don't feel competent dealing directly with the police. I feel like I need the advice of a lawyer. Once you've said that, then the police can't try to persuade you to change your mind. All further interrogation must be immediately terminated. If they do try to get you to persuade your mind, the police would necessarily be continuing to deal with you, and this is now something that you have said you need a lawyer to be able to do. So you can tell the police that you simply don't want to answer any questions, but it's more effective to lawyer up, as they say, and tell the police that you want a lawyer. Now, notice earlier I said that you have the right to tell the police that you don't wish to answer any questions or take any field sobriety tests without a lawyer. So what are these field sobriety tests? Well, in Louisiana, they generally use three. One test is called the one-leg stand test. You have to stand on one leg, holding the other about 6 inches off the ground, and count to 30. If you put your leg down to get your balance, they consider that a sign of intoxication. Another is called the walk and turn test. You walk 9 steps, heel to toe, on a straight line, turn in a specific manner as instructed by the officer, not a normal turn. It's actually kind of awkward the way they instruct you to do it. And then walk back 9 more steps on the same line. If you step off the line, if you don't touch heel to toe, if you count wrong, or if you turn slightly differently than as instructed by the officer, they consider those signs of intoxication. Probably the most important test is the horizontal gaze nystagmus test. This is a test where you stand still and you follow the officer's pen with only your eyes as he moves it back and forth in front of your face. Many people don't even recognize this as a field sobriety test because they're standing still. So it doesn't feel like a test of dexterity or balance. But it's actually the most effective for the police because it gives them neurological evidence, not voluntary muscle movement, but involuntary, neurological evidence that your central nervous system is under the influence. And here is an example, because a lot of people wonder what this horizontal gaze nystagmus is. And it's a jerkiness of the eyes, basically, as the officer moves the pen back and forth. Now, this is not a very good video. It's actually a video of a video. But if you look at the person's eyes, you will notice when they start looking off to one side, the pupil will jerk just a little bit. Watch this. There's the officer's pen. He's instructing her to hold it to watch the pin, not move her head. You can see the eyes jerking just a little bit when he goes off in each direction. That's called nystagmus. It's horizontal because he's moving the pin back and forth horizontally, and you're gazing at it. Horizontal gaze, nystagmus. All three of these tests are field sobriety tests. Many people don't realize that they can refuse these tests. But these tests are a form of interrogation. They are no less interrogation than the officer's questions about whether you've been drinking. And just like you can refuse to answer that question, you can likewise refuse to participate in the field sobriety tests. So if you're being given these tests, let me just clarify something. A lot of people think they can take these tests, and if they do well, they're going to be sent home. Okay? If I can just perform well in these field sobriety tests, the officer's going to say, you're good, go home. If you are being given these tests in the first place, it's because a law enforcement officer thinks you are intoxicated. So the chances are high you're not going home. It is a mistake to think that you can perform your way out of an arrest, especially with the horizontal gaze nystagmus test, because you don't have control over that. Like I said, the officer is giving you these tests because he has already formed the opinion that you're legally intoxicated. At this point, all you can really do is protect yourself from a conviction. So that's number 2. Remember that you have the right to tell the police officer that you don't want to answer any questions or take any field sobriety tests without a lawyer. So number 3, remember that you have the right to refuse the breath test. Now, many people are under the mistaken impression that they are required by law to take the breath test. People think this even after they hear the officer tell them that they don't have to take the breath test. Now, there are exceptions, like when there's a crash and a fatality or a serious bodily injury has occurred. But again, police give people on a silver platter everything they need to defend themselves. They read you your rights from a form, and they even give you a copy. This here, it's not a very good picture, but right here between these orange arrows, highlighted in yellow, this is from a Louisiana Department of Public Safety and Corrections official notice that is read by every police officer to every suspect in every drunk driving case. And they give you a copy. And the part that I've highlighted says, you have the right to refuse the chemical test if you're not involved in a crash where a fatality or serious bodily injury occurred. Now, it's a long form, and the officer reads the whole thing, so I understand a lot of people don't hear that, but it's there. If there was not a crash where someone died or was seriously hurt, you have the right to refuse the chemical test. If it was just a traffic stop for speeding, you have the right to refuse the chemical test. If it's a checkpoint stop, you have the right to refuse the chemical test. Now let's be clear. If you take the breath test and you blow over a .08, you have just given the state all the evidence that they need to convict you for drunk driving. I don't care how sober you felt or how well you thought you did on the standardized field sobriety test. If you take the test and you blow over a .08, you are very likely going to be convicted. You will likely be, and a lot of people ask what the penalties are, typical penalties for a first conviction. You will likely get a suspended jail sentence and be placed on probation for 12 to 18 months, supervised probation. You'll have to pay a monthly supervision fee. You'll pay a fine of between $700 and $1,000 plus court costs. You will do community service for as little as 4 or maybe as much as 15 weekends. You will attend a driver improvement class, and you will attend a substance abuse awareness class. You may also be subject to random drug and alcohol testing, not to mention what this will do to your insurance rates, your ability to obtain employment with that on your record. Now, every case is different, and every sentence is different, but these are typical sentences that you will see in just an average first offense drunk driving conviction. So those are the consequences. What are the consequences, though, of refusing the breath test? Well, first of all, if you take the test and you blow over the legal limit, your Louisiana license will be suspended for 90 days for a first offense. That's in addition to all the other stuff I just described that goes along with a conviction for drunk driving in criminal court. If you refuse the test, your Louisiana license will be suspended for 1 year for a first refusal and 2 years for a second. That's regardless of whether you get convicted later in criminal court. The suspension is strictly a penalty for refusing the breath test, not for driving drunk. But suspension's not the end of the world. If you work or you go to school, you can get a hardship license that allows you to drive to and from work and school during the suspension. So, in my opinion, for a typical first offender, the consequences of refusing the breath test are much less onerous than the consequences of getting convicted for drunk driving. And reflecting on that reminds me that there was a time when there was not nearly as much public awareness about drunk driving. When people were caught drunk driving, the police and the courts often looked the other way. And of course that wasn't a good thing. But clearly the pendulum has swung in the opposite direction. Now the police will arrest anyone who admits to even a taste of alcohol before driving. No discretion whatsoever. And unfortunately, many people are complaining that the courts have bowed to public pressure and are no longer requiring evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to convict of drunk driving. In many cases, people are saying that the courts are convicting for drunk driving on mere suspicion. Justice Tate of Louisiana Supreme Court once stated, in an opinion about a drunk driving case, he said, "When the day arrives when a person may be convicted on the basis of suspicion alone, liberty will have vanished from the land." Many people say the pendulum has swung too far, so I understand there's concern about innocent people getting caught up in a wave of intolerance against drunk driving. So, if you've had that one glass of wine with dinner, and you felt fine when you left the restaurant, but now you find yourself pulled over on the side of the road, and you're concerned, here's how to improve your odds of avoiding a conviction. Number 1, be polite to the police officer. Number 2, remember that you have the right to tell the officer that you don't want to answer any questions or take any field sobriety tests without a lawyer. And number 3, remember that you have the right to refuse the breath test. Now, will doing these things prevent you from getting arrested? No, absolutely not. If the police officer thinks you've been drinking and driving, he's going to arrest you. He's not going to put you back behind the wheel and let you drive home. However, this does give you a fighting chance to avoid a conviction later in criminal court. Now, note that I've only been licensed in Louisiana and Texas, and some of the advice given above is particular to Louisiana only. So before following this advice, you should consult a lawyer in your own state. So be polite to the police. Remember that you have the right to tell the officer you don't want to answer any questions or take any field sobriety tests without a lawyer. And remember that you have the right to refuse the breath test. Then call me. I'm Kirk Piccione. You can find me and all my contact information at kirkpiccione.com. And of course, the easiest thing to do is don't drink and drive in the first place.